Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Renee Schimmer, Product Manager for HCL Connections. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, where I'm going to talk about how to get started with HCL Connections Customizer. Thank you all for joining, and for the next 30-45 minutes, we'll see how long it takes, I'll walk you through details on what HCL Customizer is and what you can do with it. So without further ado, let's get started. This is the summary of the webinar. So this is likely what you've read already, so you know what this webinar is about. So we don't need to read this again here. But the main points are that we will talk about Connections Customizer and how it helps you to modify and personalize your collaboration environment, HCL Connections. Again, my name is Renee Schimmer. I have to show you the legal slide here for just a second, and then we'll move right on to the content where we get started. So a bit more detail on the agenda. First, I want to explain what the HCL Customizer is. I recognize a number of you in the call here, so I know that a lot of you know what this is, but for the sake of the people who might not be so familiar with what the customizer is, I will explain it in broad strokes. We'll explain a little bit how it works, and more importantly, what you can do with it, because that's really where the HCL Customizer comes into play, because it offers you a lot of capabilities when it comes to customizing what HCL Connections looks like. We'll talk a little bit about what is needed to use it, because there are some infrastructure changes that need to be made in order to make it work. So we'll talk about that. And I'll have a short recorded demo to show 3 examples on how you actually interact with the customizer and what it looks like. So let's start with what the HCL Customizer actually is. And let me start out by defining the problem that we're actually solving with it. When it comes to any out-of-the-box, off-the-shelf software, it is typically a difficult area to introduce your own customizations. With an out-of-the-box solution, you often have end users who say, well, this is not really how I would like it, or marketing comes in and says, well, this doesn't really adhere to our corporate guidelines, design guidelines, or you have the IT department say, well, we need to work this in a slightly different way so it's consistent with the rest of the applications that we use. That is business as usual, right? But that can introduce a lot of friction and a lot of cost overrun, because customizing and customizations can lead to complexities. And then most importantly, once you then upgrade the off-the-shelf software from one version to the next, you have to make sure that all the customizations that you build still work. And that's where we know that it can significantly delay the process of upgrading from one version to the next on the off-the-shelf software. That is the general problem that we're trying to solve, right? You have that with any off-the-shelf, out-of-the-box software. Customizer comes in at this point to help your organization to get to an environment that you can customize without the typical headache that you get when you have to do heavy lifting with the customizations. So what is HCL Customizer? The Customizer is a connection service, right? So you install it. It's a service that runs in addition to your core connections, and that allows an administrator or developer, not so much an end user, but really more on the admin and developer side, to customize the connections user experience. And it does that by injecting JavaScript and or style sheets to, add or change or remove capabilities and style elements, but without the negative side effects of your normal traditional customization, where you have to go deep into the code and make tweaks, etc. So that, in a nutshell, is what HCL Customizer provides. Now, let's talk a little bit about the off-the-shelf versus custom again. I talked a bit about it quite a bit already, but I just want to really get that point across. If you take an out-of-the-box solution and you install it, right? Typically, it's fairly easy. You take the software, you install it, and it runs, and it, have all the out-of-the-box functionality available to you. And that usually means the TCO up to this point is pretty low. But the problem is, on the other end of the spectrum, you have end users and business requirements and whatnot that require that you change the user experience, because the ultimate goal is to have happy end users. Only if you have happy end users do you get the adoption out of the software that you want to implement. And this is where the customizer comes in, because it gives you the balance between not breaking the bank by introducing customizations, not breaking the upgrade path from one version to the next, but at the same time introducing features or style elements and whatnot to please the end user to drive adoption, right? So this is how the two really come together, and the customizer helps you strike that right balance. So how does it work? We'll go through a simple example how typically an end user requests content from connections and then gets it back. So here we have Diane, and with her browser, she's requesting one of the connections pages simply from the connection server, right? So far, no magic. It's just a browser with a typical request to the connection server. The server knows what page to send back. It assembles the HTML with the style sheet with the JavaScript that's in there and sends it back to Diane's browser, and she can then view it. That's your typical standard behavior, and that's how the end user experience is presented to users. Now, if we introduce the customizer to the picture, we actually add one additional step here, where we can actually also recognize who the user is, where the user is coming from, what they're looking at, and say, hey, here we have Diane. We have a special rule for this user, because she might be a member of a list of people who should see certain features or should not see certain features. And then we can actually inject additional JavaScript or CSS styles into the response that the server sends back to Diane's browser. And therefore, she has now the updated experience for her, right? So nothing changed on the part where the server, on the actual HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that resides on the core connection server. There are no core customizations to the standard out-of-the-box capabilities. It's an additional step where the customization is injected in as soon as the right person requests that page that they want to look at, right? That's the important distinction. And that part there, that is what the customizer does, right? Okay, so that sounds pretty straightforward. And another way to put this is here in this flow diagram to see how the actual process works. So the user forwards a request to connections, they get a response, but then we have an element called the app registry. And in the app registry, that's where we have the possible extensions loaded. Extensions are the code snippets that define the customizations that the admin or developer has built to be used with the customizer. If a certain condition is met, for example, Diane is a member of the marketing team, therefore she should see this particular page with that customization, then let's say JavaScript is injected, sent back to Diane's browser, and she can see the changes, right? So a couple of important elements here. Number one is that you can define conditions. You can define whether a customization is set for the entire organization, if everybody should see it, which is typically what you would do if you just want to change the overall branding, right? Or you might have specific regions where if you are in a specific region, maybe you have, I don't know, a different weather widget load on the page to show you, your conditions in where the locale that you are in. Or you can also create white lists or black lists for people who should or should not see a certain feature. And I know that there's one customer that we worked with who had a requirement that not every user should be allowed to create an external community. An external community is a community that people outside the organization can access. And they wanted to keep a lid on that and said that we only have 30 people who should be allowed to do that. So those 30 people are then managed on a list, and the customizer can check, are you on that list, Diane? If yes, then you see the button to create an external community. Right? That would be one great example how you can really easily change the functionality of connections down to that granular level. And it is really straightforward to do. So conditions can be met. And if the conditions are met, then the JavaScript and style sheets either add or remove things to the page that are sent back to the user. Okay, so what can you do with it? I already talked a little bit about examples, but let's keep that a little broader now. You can add new functionality. So the example that I talked about with restricting who can create external communities, that was basically a restriction, right? You have a policy of use, and you can define who can do what. But you can also add completely new functionality. If you want to add an integration to a third party on your community homepage, you can do that, right? But you can also hide or alter existing elements. So if you don't like a certain element in the main navigation, you can hide that or change it. You can access outside content via Ajax or SOAP and others, right? Where you can, and that's what I'm going to show you, can use content coming from non-connection system to be pulled into connections. But of course, you also have access to all the native connections content, for example, files or wikis, blogs, etc. Obviously, you can manipulate those and pull it in to your heart's content. But it also has access to the browser data, which is where the cookies are stored, where you have the session stored, so you can actually build conditions around, the session, if it's how long has it been, etc., to build any sort of rule around that. And one element that often gets overlooked is the predictive caching. So typically you would think when I showed you the how it's working with Diane's request going to the server, and then there's this additional step of the customizer checking a condition and injecting code, where you would think, that will slow things down, right? No, it does not. The first time maybe a little bit, but one key element of the customizer is that it also has a built-in cache that actually keeps elements that have been requested previously, so the response time will actually get faster. Right, so it's a bit counterproductive or counterintuitive, not productive, counterintuitive, but the built-in cache in the customizer actually helps you to have better response time, especially in across various geos if you have users from around the world accessing it. Okay, so those are the things on a very high level that you can do with Customizer. But let's walk through a few simple examples here. And the first one I want to talk about is branding. Branding can be defined by many things. It can be the colors that are used. It can be the font that is used. It can be the styles of the buttons that are used. Ideally, the marketing team would like all of this to be as close as possible to your corporate identity, right? If a company has a style guideline where all these things are defined, a whole design book, then you want to make sure the connections environment, your intranet adheres to it as much as possible. And that is one of the great examples where you can actually easily inject on the global scale for connections all these definitions. And the example here is a very simple one where we have a profiles page that is out of the box, where we can inject a visual update, as we call it, where things change. For example, you see even starting on the top, the My Profile, My Network directory, now the style is slightly different. The My Profile is more bold. The blue line has another line that goes through it. The buttons have rounded corners. At the bottom, the recent updates is a slightly different style. These are all very subtle changes, but sometimes that is what makes the difference, and giving it that slightly different experience that makes it more like your own organization. You can do more dramatic changes, where here again we have a profile page that's completely standard, simple, but then on any profile page you can actually insert, entire graphics, not just different font, not just different colors, but you have entire different images, etc., and layouts of the profile page. All of this can be done without having to go into the actual code of the product, right? So this gives you endless possibilities on how you can do simple things by just changing the style sheet, all for the sake of branding, for example. So let's look at another example. Here we have a tiny little piece of the header navigation in Connections. And I'll show you what you can do here in terms of adding or hiding features or buttons or menu choices. So I already mentioned the example of the creating the external community, right, where we have a whitelist of people who are actually allowed to do that. But other customers that we know have used this, who wanted to limit the ability for users to upload files that are public to the entire organization. Goes a little bit against my understanding of how collaboration should work and the spirit of Connections, but people use it for different use cases. And some customers said, we don't want public files, so you can actually hide that capability when you upload a file. The button to make it public can be hidden and removed. Invite external users, right? If you don't want certain users to be able to invite users that are outside the organization, you can hide it to those users. You can delete content, etc. But this example that I want to show here is where you maybe want to integrate it with same time to start a meeting. You can actually insert a button in the top nav bar really easily and inject that little camera there that represents the capability to start your meeting right now, right? That would be a very, very simple extension here. And again, everything you define is not necessarily global. It can be done selectively by URL pattern or by user attributes, right? Who's the user, email ID, and other regular expressions. So let's talk about a third example here. And this is regarding integration. The integration topic here means that you can do customizations that are not limited to the scope of Connections or even HCL products. You can extend that and bring in third-party applications or third-party or content from third-party applications into your Connections experience. And there's a number of different ways in how you can do it. I mean, most simply, you can insert, an iframe, but that's, not that elegant. You can do other things where you can actually pass on structured queries and get results back from whatever application you're doing. The simple example that we have here is similar to what we added in Connections 7 as part of the standard product, is the ability to share whatever page you're on with your chat tool of choice. So here what I'm showing is the Teams button. So if you're running on Connection 7 and you have this set up, you have this already anyway, but let's say you're still on Connection 6.5, you want to add that, you can do that with a customizer, right? And that's one thing I'll show you in the recorded demo as well. And what this does is it takes the URL of the page that you're currently looking at, and then you can send this off to your chat tool of choice. If you're using Slack, you can actually do that in a similar way to where you say, who do you want to share it with? It opens the chat window and then inserts the URL to that page. And then you can start a chat and that person can easily go back to whatever you were talking about here. Okay, we have other examples where people did that with Box or with WebEx. So many things can be done here. In terms of examples, the entire documentation and a list of samples can be found on GitHub. So if you go to HCL Tech Software on GitHub and look for connection samples, you'll see a number of examples. The Teams integration that I mentioned is there. There are a couple of other things here, same time integrations, a web meeting, a news river, and so forth. Those can be downloaded there and added if you just want to see how it's done or use examples as they are. So I'll leave this up for just one more second in case you want to grab a screenshot and get the URL. But this is where you would find also not just the samples, but also documentation. Okay, so now let's talk about what you need to use it. Most importantly, the HCL Customizer can be deployed in 2 different flavors. And flavor doesn't mean in terms of what it can do. That's the same in both methods, right? This is really how do you actually roll it out? What infrastructure do you need to use it? Both capabilities that I'll talk about here offer the exact same capability. First of all, if you're using connections and the component pack is part of the picture, the customizer is already in there, right? So this will hopefully be the default way to get it. So if you have connections, you install the component pack, customizer is already in there. If you decided to not go with the component pack, you're still on connections without the component pack, you can still add the customizer Lite, as we call it, as a standalone add-on. And that has significantly less overhead to it because it doesn't have to deal with all the other requirements that the component pack brings to the table, right? But again, Customizer Lite doesn't refer to the functionality. It's just what's required to get it to work. So let's look at how we actually get Customizer with the component pack. What you see on the screen is on the right side there, connections running on WAS, and you have the HTTP server, right? It's just the standard core connections. But when you add the component pack with Kubernetes, with MongoDB and Redis, etc., to get all the component pack features to work, you notice the MW proxy and the proxy host there. That is part of what the customizer brings you. That's the part that does the predictive caching and checks conditions and then injects whatever code you want to insert into the response. But you see, in order to get this working, you have to go down the Kubernetes path and the full component pack stack, right? Now, if you want to use the same functionality, but without the component pack, before I go there, I always forget this slide here. I want to spend just a minute on what else the component pack gives you. Because the component pack, in addition to the customizer, has a lot of capabilities that we feel are really key to a complete user experience. So you see the customizer Lite and metrics Lite on top above the yellow line. Those are available without having to run the full component pack. Below the yellow line is everything that you get when you install the component pack. So we have the metrics, we have quick results, which is in simple terms a type ahead. When you start typing in the search field, you get quick results, or if you go to files, you see the files that you recently viewed. That's what quick results is. You have PDF export if you want to export what page you're on, a wiki, for example, to PDF. And there's the customizer. And then we have Activities Plus, Orient Me, the Teams integration, and what we call tailored experience, which is an extension to the community model where you get the support for community templates as well as the creation wizard. All of that comes with a component pack, and that explains a little bit why you have all these components on the slide before that are required. But if we now talk about just the Customizer Lite, in terms of boxes, it looks like there's a similar amount of stuff required, but a lot of the heavy components have been removed, right? There is no Kubernetes. It's now running on Docker Compose. There is no MongoDB because the file system is used. There is no Redis because the memory cache is used, right? So it's significantly lighter and a lot easier to deploy if you go down this path. Again, capability is exactly the same. Okay, so I will not go into the full detail on how you set it up, right? I would be not be the right person to do that, but you'll see in the documentation that we have laid this out. There's plenty of information helping you to get started, and I have the links a little bit later in the presentation for you to grab to see what the steps are to get to where you need to be. So once you have the customizer running and configured, the next question is, all right, I want to write a couple of scripts. I want to, change the styles and create a custom CSS. How do I get it there? So the way you do this is, let's say you have a simple style sheet that changes the button styles and the font, right? So you put that together. And before you do anything, you can test it, for example, using Grease Monkey in your browser. So you have the file locally, and basically your browser grabs it from your hard drive, injects it into the page, and you can see what it looks like. So all the visual testing, does it work? What does it look like? You can do just like that on your local machine. Once you're happy, you then upload it to GitHub. And then from GitHub, it's either pulled automatically or via a pull request to your Connections Customizer server. And then there, it's basically ready to run once you enable it in the app registry, right? So that's one step that is not mentioned here, but that I'm going to show you. We have the app registry where you can see all the loaded extensions and turn them on or off individually and define what applications and connections make use of it. Do you want it in files, in profiles, in wikis, but not in blocks? You can easily set that in the app registry. So once all of that's done, you basically are ready to roll out those customizations to the end users. But before you do that, since you can target who sees it, you can do a lot of testing without any end user being affected while you do test, right? All you need to do is set up a condition that only you and maybe your team of testers can see the customization. It will therefore not affect, even though it's on the production environment, not affect any of the other end users or put any other capability at risk, right? It's isolated, it's separated, and therefore a really good way to add customizations because you can easily turn them on or off on the fly. Okay, so that is how you get the customizations in. And now we come to the last part of the presentation here, where I walk through a quick demo of some simple examples, right? The demo here is designed to show you, okay, what does the app registry look like? What do the extensions look like? How do I turn them on or off? And what does the code on a higher level look like? So we'll walk through 3 simple examples. And what you see on the screen is the app registry. And we see 7 cards here. Those 7 cards represent extensions that have been loaded via the process I showed you on the previous screen to the customizer on this connections instance. So we have a number of integrations here with Teams. We have one with Same Time. There's a visual update, etc. So let's go right ahead and look at some of them. So we start with the visual update. And you see on the 3 dots, you can enable or disable it. Now we switch to enable. It is now enabled. And we can click on the card to get to the actual element. And here is the actual code, which is very straightforward. State is enabled. And then we have the extensions: name, title, type, payload, right? So we basically define here what the payload is. You see, it's all CSS. Global CSS, home CSS. So these are all different style sheets that are loaded, and you can define them per component. So there's bookmarks. where we have a dog ear CSS and dog ears enabled. Dog ear is what bookmarks used to be called previously, right? So now we see that this style sheet is enabled and will be loaded for the bookmarks application and connections. We can also switch to the visual view here where we have the same elements for each application within connections. We can define whether it's enabled or not. So if I want to turn the customization off for bookmarks, I can do that and just disable it here or in the code, but that's all you need to do. So now we switch to connections and take a look at the blue bar and each of the updates in the activity stream. I'm refreshing now because we just enabled the extension, and now you see that the cards are actually surrounded by the square with a slight shadow. The navigation I'm following, status updates, is slightly different. Again, subtle changes, but that sometimes makes the difference, right? And you saw how we did that. We enabled the extension, we refreshed the browser, and it sees, oh, wait, there is now a different style sheet I need to load as well. Let's do that. And now we go to profiles, and there we see the round buttons that we saw previously in the slide. That was also loaded through that extension. So if I go back here to the app registry, I can also disable all of it, all of the customizations. If I go back to the browser and refresh, you see we're now back to the square buttons because this extension has now been disabled and the server, the customizer, knows not to inject it anymore, and therefore we have the normal experience again. All right, so let's look at the next example here, share to MS Teams. So if we go to the code editor, it's very short, right? What we do is, right now it's disabled. We have the payload, which is a Connections Teams Share Integration JavaScript, and it's set to global, the path, which means this will be applied to all of the connections experience, no matter what page I'll open. There's also a cache control, but the important part is here, it's set to global, and we're loading a JavaScript. So next thing we need to do is we need to set that to enabled, which we're doing now. Enable right here. We go back to the browser and look at the upper right-hand corner where the magnifying glass is. That where now the Teams icon was added. And as I click on it, it will open up Teams here in my browser. Obviously not mine because I'm not David, but you can now actually start typing in a name of a user or a community or a channel, sorry, a channel, and then you see shared from connections, and the URL to the page that I'm on will be inserted, and now I can share this into Teams and then, you know, have a conversation there with members of a channel or an individual that I picked to talk about this page. All right, so let's close this out. And let's go back to the app registry. One more example that we're going to look at. But before we do that, I think we're going to disable it again just to see that it will then disappear. Yeah, so disable, we go back to the same page that we were. And again, look at the upper right-hand corner, refresh, and now the Teams integration icon disappeared. That was quick, but I hope you saw it. So now let's talk about the third and last example, which is how you can add a same time meeting to the connections homepage. So you see the path is homepage, right? That's the application that will be affected, and it will load a URL in an iframe. So this is a simple example where we add an iframe by enabling it to the connections homepage. So if I go back and now refresh the homepage that we're on, you will see that an iframe will be added and pointing to the same time meeting server. Just waiting for the refresh here. There it comes. And here we now have same time meetings right there injected on top of the activity stream. Is that a particularly useful example? Not sure. It's not how I would do it, but this is just to show how simple and easy it is to insert something like this, an iframe that points to another application right here on any of the connections pages, in this case, the home page. So this concludes the demo. Those were 3 quick, very simple examples. And I hope it demonstrates to you how easy it is to actually build your own customizations, load them to your connection server, and then turn them on or off. We didn't go into too great of a detail on how to actually define the rules, the conditions of who sees it, but it's all in there. You can set the rules pretty easily on who sees it, and that hopefully should make clear that there is very limited risk here in terms of affecting your production environment, right? Which is usually one of the big concerns if you do customizations the old way, where you have to run it forever on dev and then on test and then roll it out to production and then something goes wrong, so you have to roll it back. Here, all of this can be done in a very contained way, a very targeted way, without affecting the broad audience of who's using connections. You can do the testing in a very safe manner. So with this, I want to point to some of the resources that I've already mentioned. So here are some URLs to go to, and I wish there was a way to make those clickable in the meeting, but they're not. So maybe take a screenshot. So there's the component pack install configuration steps if you want to go with a full component pack that gives you all these other great features. And then, of course, there's the customization, the documentation just for the customizer, which is on the GitHub HCL Tech software area that I showed you earlier, and the samples as well. It's the same URL. They're both just different folders. So that's where you will find more information about the customizer, how to use it, how to get it up and running, and so forth. And with that, we actually reached the end of the presentation. So I was not able to pay attention to the chat. So let me just do that real quick. If there are any questions that are unanswered, doesn't look like it. If you have any question, post them in here and we'll answer them. But if not, I hope this was useful to you. I hope this gave you maybe a new insight, or if you haven't heard of Customizer before, an explanation as to what it is, what it does, why it's important, and how in broad strokes you can use it and work with it. So I'll just pause here for just 1 second. But if there are no further questions, I would like to thank you all for your time in joining us this morning or this afternoon, and we'll catch you on the next webinar. Thank you very much.